Hello, I'm Ajua. Welcome to Ajua Biotech. In today's video, we're looking at the fascinating, bizarre history of blood transfusions, from ancient practices to groundbreaking discoveries. Before the 17th century, so by the 17th century, as you know, we're referring to the 1600s to 1699. Before that time, much of what we thought we knew about the heart and blood turned out to be wrong. Why did we get it so wrong for so long? If we go right back, maybe we will understand. So let's start at 1550 BC. And we encounter the African, specifically Egyptian Book of the Dead, which glorified the heart as the seed of emotion, intellect, and in the Egyptian society, their equivalent of the soul. The heart was weighed against the feather of a deity called Mot, and depending on how that weighing turned out, you were rewarded with their version of an afterlife, or if you were found wanting, you met a painful and final end. Specifically, you were eaten by a monster. During the mummification process, the Egyptians would yank the brain out of your head via a tongue that they shoved up your nose. But the heart was placed on a separate urn and given the respect that the Egyptians thought that it deserved. And this influenced what we will discuss shortly, the surprisingly long practice of medicinal bleeding. So the 2nd century, and was a surgeon who worked predominantly in gladiator arenas, and gladiators were a form of professional fighters who engaged in combat as a form of entertaining the public. His work meant that he was exposed to a lot of blood and organs. Now, while Galen saw a lot of organs and blood as a surgeon to people who fought for a living, he was not allowed to study anatomy of humans. Instead, he had to use animals, as there was a law against using humans in his research. So while he learned a lot and wrote a lot, he got quite a bit wrong. His teachings carried forward what he had learned from the Greeks and Romans before him, and a particular belief about balancing what they call the 4 humors. This belief about the 4 humors led to a dangerous but widespread practice of medicinal bleeding. The 4 humors were identified as black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. Blood was the easiest humor that one could get their hands on readily, so medicinal bleeding thrived. It was used to treat every manifestation of illness, ailment, or disorder. So with this in mind, it shouldn't shock you then that on December 14, 1799, the then US President George Washington was bled an equivalent of 2.5 liters of blood when he came down with a sore throat. Unfortunately for him, he died the next day. So coming then to the heart of the topic, when did the concept of transfusions come into play? The key event was the determination by one William Harvey and others that blood was not burned off on a one-way trip from the liver, as Galen had suggested, but it circulated. The logical extension of that knowledge was that adding substances to the circulatory system would have a powerful therapeutic effect. Historians believe the road to blood transfusion looked something like this. A man by the name of Christopher Wren performed physiological experiments in dogs. In one of the first documented experiments of injecting fluids into the blood under laboratory conditions, the next researcher widely recognized along this bizarre path to blood transfusion is English doctor Richard Lower. In 1665, Lower, following Wren's work, bled one dog to near death and then revived the dog by transfusing blood from a second dog. Meanwhile, in France, you also had Jean-Baptiste Denis, a doctor who was a specialist to the illustrious ruler Louis XIV, and he was likewise performing transfusions. In June 1667, a small amount of lamb's blood was given to a 15-year-old boy. The boy's physician, had previously bled him 20 times, trying to cure him from an ailment, and it clearly wasn't working. So Denis took over and takes out yet a little bit more blood and puts in instead lamb's blood. The boy survives. 5 months from Denis' experiments in France, a British researcher, Richard Lower, transfuses blood from a sheep into a human. Like Denis' patient, this man survives. Back in France, a mentally ill man by the name of Antoine Marat was driving his neighbors crazy. Marat's wife asked Dr. Denis to help, and in an attempt to do so, Dr. Denis transfused some calf's blood into him. The treatment seemed to work because the patient looked rather quiet after the intervention. So 2 days later, they repeated the procedure. The idea was to remove some of the bad blood and replace it with better blood, in this case, blood from an animal. Dr. Denis was perhaps understandably bolder in this round of experimentation and gave him more than the first round. Immediately, Marat reports burning sensation in his arm and pain in his kidney.
Why, God, why?
A day later, Marat experiences nosebleeds, chills, fever, and he starts to pass cold black urine for several days. The doctors actually misunderstand the cold black urine as a sign of the bad stuff coming out, and so they think they've achieved success. 2 months later, it was very clear that little had changed in Marat. His wife wanted Dr. Denis to repeat the procedure, but Dr. Denis hesitated when he saw the state that Marat was in. The very next day, Marat died. This led to Dr. Denis being arrested, and although he was later acquitted, it led to a ban on transfusions in France, which eventually caught on in Rome, England, and other European countries by 1670 due to additional deaths as a result of transfusions. The ban lasted for over 100 years. So we come back to the US, and by the late 17th century, so 1700 to 1799, they were still going ahead with transfusions. It was all xenotransfusions at this point. And it was not only an accepted form of treatment, but it was quite popular. Yet, at the death of George Washington, something previously unfathomable happened. The family doctor suggested that Washington, contrary to conclusions of his top-of-the-class physicians, had died from losing too much blood. The next person to help in advancing our knowledge around blood transfusions is a man that was born in Barbados. We meet one named John Leacock. Leacock studied in Edinburgh. He performed these experiments involving xeno and allo transfusions and published a single paper in 1817. He performed around 7 to 8 animal-to-animal transfusions. So he had both xeno and allo transfusions. He had transfusions between dog to dog. He did 3 of these experiments. He had a transfusion experiment involving a dog to a cat, so xenotransfusion, and 3 more xenotransfusions between a lamb and a dog. And from Leacock's experiment, he made this insightful contribution towards the journey of understanding blood transfusions and the role that it plays. He made these statements in his pivotal work that blood from an animal of the same species is sufficient to support life, but blood from an animal of a different species appears not to answer the purpose. So let's now take you to London, and a London-based obstetrician in the 1820s by the name of James Blundell. So in the middle of 1820s, he attended a delivery where the woman lost a lot of blood. Blundell was not able to save her life, but kept ruminating about what had happened. He reasoned that had she had blood replaced after the loss, she might have lived. Having read Leacock's paper on transfusions in animals, he decided to return to the practice of blood transfusions. He got his opportunity in 1829. Blundell is once again faced with a similar situation of a woman that gave birth and she's bleeding profusely. He carries out the first recognized blood transfusions using the patient's husband as a donor. Remarkably, the procedure saves the life of the woman. Blundell is encouraged and in the following days, weeks, and months improves the equipment that he plans to use for future transfusions. Now, obviously, Blundell got very lucky because at this point, nothing is known about blood typing. The husband and wife must have had compatible blood type. But even with Blundell's success, problems with blood clotting faster than the transfusions can be conducted, along with severe reactions and generally poor outcomes, sustains dissatisfaction with blood transfusions. More often than not, blood transfusions lead to disastrous outcomes prior to the discovery of blood typing in 1901. This dissatisfaction leads some doctors to look for other fluids that they can transfuse. Milk is selected as a candidate fluid because when it was viewed under the microscope, its microscopic fat globules were mistaken by doctors and researchers at the time to be blood cells. The milk globules were thought to be developing white and red blood cells. There was a short period where milk transfusions were all the rage. Transfusions of cow milk were first attempted in Canada in 1854. The most enthusiastic embrace of milk transfusions, however, occurred in the USA in 1873. And I'm seeing a trend here, if you're following, where the US, it seems anything goes. They never banned blood transfusions, and this milk transfusion is really catching on in the USA. Milk from cows are used, goats, and even humans are used for transfusion. The outcomes with milk transfusions were not great. There were some deaths, but there were still clinicians and researchers who were pushing for it. So now we enter the 20th century, and Karl Landsteiner is a clinician who is obsessing over blood and how to be able to use it in transfusions. So blood cells, he discovers, like other cells, have antigens on their surfaces, on the cell surfaces. There are a total of 33 different classification systems for blood based on the surface antigens that they display, but the two that are that most of us need to worry about because of their clinical relevance are the ABO and the RH system. Thanks to Landsteiner, we discovered that there are 4 groups, that 4 antigen types, 3 and 1 lack of antigen, that are present on blood cell surfaces in relation to transfusion reactions. And we have the A, the B, the AB, and the O, which means they don't have any antigen actually displayed. So this is a brief chart of the kind of developments in equipment and technology that allowed blood transfusion to be safer and more widely accepted and practiced. In 1907, we have the cryo blood transfusion apparatus, which doubles as a bicycle pump. How's that for engineering? Then you have in the 1913 paraffin-coated glass tubes, and this with a cannula, and this was an attempt to try and stop clotting because the blood clots. In 1914, you have portability improvements, and critically, you have sodium citrate, which is introduced, and sodium citrate is, if you're looking at the reaction that leads to clotting, it sequesters calcium and therefore stops the blood from clotting. Then in 1915, you have Dr. Bernheim, who designed an apparatus that's meant to be an indirect way to get for the blood transfusion. So it goes into the vein of the donor, and then it also is attached to the vein of the recipient. In 1943, with World War II, there were also further improvements that were introduced to the blood transfusion story. In particular, I mentioned Dr. Charles Drew's contribution. Dr. Charles Drew completed his medical and Master of Surgery degrees in 1933. During his internship and residency at Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal, Drew studied issues related to blood transfusions, or the process of transferring blood through an intravenous line. Continuing his research in this area, he earned a Rockefeller Fellowship in 1938, pursued a doctorate at Columbia University, where he began working with physician John Skoda. Together, Drew and Skoda conducted extensive research in blood preservation and fluid replacement and developed a trial blood bank. Drew's 1940 doctoral thesis was Banked Blood, a study in blood preservation, and this cemented his status as an expert in this developing field. Drew's breakthroughs in blood preservation occurred at a critical time as World War II was ongoing in Europe and Great Britain. Great Britain needed large amounts of blood and plasma to treat its wounded soldiers. Using the experimental blood bank they had just tested as a blueprint, Drew and Skoda spearheaded the Blood for Britain program to ship plasma overseas. Blood contains two primary components, as we know: blood cells that carry oxygen throughout the body, and plasma, which is primarily water mixed with proteins and electrolytes. Plasma is effective in helping replace essential fluids and treating shock, two functions essential to saving lives. Additionally, plasma on its own is easier to preserve and transport, and it can be used with any blood type. So Drew and his team developed novel ways to extract, preserve, and ship plasma on a large scale, sending something like 5,000 life-saving liters of plasma to England. Now, following the success of the Blood for Britain program in 1941, Drew became both the first black surgeon to serve as an examiner on the American Board of Surgery and the first director of the American Red Cross Blood Bank in New York. He created several mobile blood donation stations, which would later be known as blood mobiles. Now, despite the great need for blood as the US entered World War II, the armed forces insisted that the Red Cross pilot project follow the racist policy of excluding black donors. Though in January 1942, the Red Cross announced it would begin accepting blood from black donors, it would still segregate the blood. Of course, Drew objected to such policies. In 1944, he wrote a letter to the director of the Federal Labor Standards Association regarding the segregation of blood by the National Blood Bank. Drew wrote, "It was a bad mistake for three reasons. No official department of the federal government should willfully humiliate its citizens. 2, there is no scientific basis for the order. And 3, they need blood." So if you were paying attention, you would have learned that blood transfusions started with xeno and allotransfusions within animals, and then that progressed into animal transfusions into humans before finally James Blundell's seminal work of transferring blood from a husband to a wife who was losing blood. There was blood typing by Carl Landsteiner back in 1901 with subsequent discoveries of additional antigens that can cause transfusion reactions. But before that, due to dissatisfaction with blood transfusions, there were transfusions of milk. Then there were improvements around the apparatus used for blood transfusions. You have your paraffin-coated glass tubes, then finally sodium citrate being used to allow transfusions to occur at a delayed period because previously it had to be done simultaneously due to clotting. There were further improvements during World War II with Charles Drew, and his separation of plasma from the blood cells component so that you had longevity in storage and allowed transfusions to occur. I have a few questions here taken from the history that you may want to test yourself on. And then finally, I'll catch you in the next video. God bless. In the next video. God bless. Bye.